As promised, this video is going to focus on the ins and outs of office hours, the different ways you can use office hours, how to prepare for them, and how to use them to best effect, both in the short term, meaning the class you're in right now, but also some long-term uses, in particular preparing for when you're going to ask your future professors or current professors for recommendation letters. So the first thing I just kind of want to lay out is that in my experience, students and professors tend to look at office hours very differently. Often in my experience, students tend to look at office hours as a kind of last resort only, to the point that students have frequently apologized to me when scheduling their office hours, or even apologized in advance, not even scheduling their office hours. So they might say something like, oh, I'm really sorry, you're probably going to see me a lot in office hours, or, oh, I'm really sorry, but I need to make an appointment for office hours. And it always kind of takes me aback a little, because whether or not students know this, office hours belong to you. And there's actually a kind of shift, or a movement, we might even call it, to stop calling this time that is set aside in professor's schedule, to stop calling that office hours, i.e. time you can expect a professor to be in their office, and instead to call it student hours, which I actually really like. It's not on my syllabus that way yet, but I think it's going to be in the very near future. But I really like that trend, because what it does is it actually is a little bit more accurate. It draws attention more to what those office hours, or those hours, that section of time, is really meant to be focusing on. It's a time set aside for student use. And so one of the things that I always try to tell my students is you don't have to be worried that you're bothering me or your other professors. That time is set aside for you. Now, one thing to be careful of is to know what your different professors' rules are for office hours. Some really require that you make appointments for office hours so that they don't have a kind of traffic jam and too many students show up at the same time, and then they can't accommodate everyone. So they try to avoid that by making every student have an appointment set in advance. I don't do that personally. The flip side of that is that a student might show up and someone might already be in my office, whether it's virtual or in the physical space, and they may have to wait their turn. And so that's kind of a risk of the situation that I have. On the other hand, it means that a student doesn't have to know in advance whether or not they want to drop in for office hours. So there are kinds of pros and cons, but it's kind of on the student to know what each professor for each of their classes wants, because it's very likely not going to be the same across the line. That may be on their syllabus, or the professor may mention it the first day of class. If it's not in either of those places, you might just ask the professor, especially if you're thinking about going to office hours soon, just check in with them what their policy is. Okay, so to kind of get back to the first point, though, the ways that students often use their office hours frequently don't serve them all that well. So very frequently, by the time a student comes to me, especially if they're kind of looking at it as a last resort, it's actually usually about 3 to 4 weeks past the point where I really have very many options to help them. So if a student's been missing for 6 weeks and hasn't turned in any work, and the semester is ending in a week, there aren't a lot of plausible ways, right, that I can help them. I've literally had students disappear the second week of classes, show up the last week of classes and say, what do I do? And, at that point, there might be something that the school's administration can do if there's a documented emergency or crisis that happened. But in terms of this class, there's almost nothing I can do. It's not very plausible that a student can make up 13 weeks of work in a week. Right? So that's one thing to kind of keep in mind, is if things are starting to go a little awry, or if you see a crisis, an emergency, a health event, anything like that that's starting to happen that you predict might affect your ability to keep track in your classes, it's not a bad idea just to give your professors a heads up in office hours or an email. You do not have to give us all of the details, but telling us ahead of time is really helpful, because sometimes we can help make kind of plans with you. And then also, if you disappear, we have some context, and we can sometimes also help hook you up with services that the school has to help you in those situations. But it's a lot easier for us to process what's going on and to kind of keep in mind what's going on than to find out weeks and weeks later and then try to figure out what to do after the fact. So that's just something to keep in mind. So the other thing that I would like to say is if you come to us in an emergency, let's say you've missed weeks and weeks and weeks of class, sometimes office hours, even, you know, though it would make sense for you to come in and talk to us, sometimes that's not the most effective use that you're ever going to potentially get out of office hours. Because I don't know about you, but when I'm panicked, when I'm upset, when I've been through it and I'm still going through it, which is usually the case in those types of situations, it's very hard to process information. And so what happens in those types of meetings is we may try to make an action plan, but it may still be very hard, especially if you are still in crisis, to follow through on that action plan. So again, I can only reiterate, you know, what it's most effective for you to come in, you know, in those cases where something's going wrong, as early as possible. When you start, you know, when you've missed an assignment, when you've missed one class, when you've missed two classes, at least the digital check-in, and then we can kind of try to reassess and have a game plan for you, is going to be much more effective, especially because at that point, hopefully you aren't as panicked and worn down as you likely are deep into a crisis, and when you might feel really underwater in a lot of classes at the same time. Okay, so that's just something I would suggest. Okay, but let's talk about all the different kinds of ways, not just the kind of last resort use of office hours, but the other kinds of office hours that often I think students don't necessarily feel authorized, or it just doesn't occur to them to use, but often are the kinds of ways that professors kind of assume students can, should, would want to use office hours. So for example, very frequently I get very few office hour visitors in the first month to month and a half of classes. And in some ways, I mean, it's a real shame, right? Because that's a really effective time for students to, one, get into the habit of coming to office hours, and two, pick up some really useful skills for the class. Okay, so let's talk about some of the different uses that you might have for office hours. And I kind of think of these in terms of short term and long term. So I'm going to share screen with you just for a moment here. Here we go. In terms of short-term uses of office hours, so these are office hours that are focused on this class only. Number one, to supplement classroom discussion. I think we've all had moments in a classroom where a teacher has glossed over something too quickly and you wanted to ask a question, or you just wanted to linger with it a little bit more, or you thought of a way that it connected with your own life or an interest of yours. But they moved past it, or maybe somebody raised their hand and kind of took the class into a different direction, and the moment was kind of lost, and you still kind of want to sit with that, or you're thinking about using that in an assignment, but you're not sure if you should, you know, those types of moments, or you just have a question about something, but you didn't feel comfortable in the moment asking in front of people, or again, the conversation moved and you didn't want to drag it back. All of those kinds of things where the timing of class, or just how much time there was in class, didn't give you the space to have the conversation you would have rather have had. That is a great place or a great reason to use office hours. your professor is not going to think that's a waste of their time, right? We get into this because these are topics we're interested in. We assign readings theoretically, right? Because we think they're interesting, and we have, we think there are interesting conversations that can be had around them. And so, come to our office hours and talk about that. And the kind of script for that is I thought this was really interesting in class, and I kind of wanted to talk about this, but the conversation got away from us, and tell them what you were thinking. And that's a great place to start a really interesting conversation. Okay, I promise to you, this is a valid use of office hours. Number two, and this is kind of linked to number one of the kind of stealth reasons to go to office hours is it helps you build and develop a better rapport and communication with your professor. This is extremely useful if you always seem to have a little bit of a disconnect. You can verbalize that there's a little bit of a disconnect. I've had times when students have said, hey, you talk a little too fast for me, or you keep using X word, or you keep, when you talk about this, I'm having a lot of trouble following you. So sometimes students will very directly just say, hey, the way you're trying to communicate with me isn't working, and I can then adjust. But in a kind of more holistic sense, more communication with a person helps you to understand their frameworks a little bit better. And time with office hours has sometimes helped the student kind of figure out, oh, this is kind of how she rolls. And then when they hear me in class later, something that maybe wouldn't have clicked with them clicks with them better, because they've just got a kind of better library of me, right? And so, that works out a little bit better after office hours. One reason why you want to develop that rapport and communication as well is if you have a crisis or an emergency, or you're just concerned about something later, sometimes it can feel a little forbidding to go to your professor, especially depending on personalities, or, just sometimes when you're just being really dragged down by life, it can just seem really, really hard to talk to your professors about it, or really talk to anybody about it. And if you already have a bedrock of a kind of solid relationship with your professors, that's probably going to feel a little less daunting, right? You're not going to feel as rough talking to a professor about this if that professor is someone who, isn't your buddy. Like, we're never your buddies, but we're at least as someone who feels like an actual person, right? And someone you think of who thinks of you as a person. Hopefully all of your professors do. I would like to think we all do, but if you've actually had the kinds of interactions where you really have that kind of one-on-one connection, you're probably going to feel a lot more comfortable bringing those kinds of issues in an effective way to that professor. Okay. One thing that my strongest students have a habit of doing, and I think a lot of my students would really benefit from doing, is to strategize their assignments, and especially their bigger assignments, papers, research projects. Sorry, my cat TA is chiming in here. But to strategize those bigger assignments very early on in the assignment. So sometimes students will come to me before they've even started writing and saying, I'm thinking about writing about X, or I'm thinking about approaching the question in Y way. And we just kind of toss that back and forth, and I might give them some advice or kind of poke some holes in it before they go out, so they can head problems off at the pass before they've gotten 3 pages in, right? Or before they're a whole draft in, because it's a lot harder to cut things than to plan things ahead of time and write them the way you'd like to, or to write a stronger first draft, right? If you anticipate things that might be difficult for you in a class during the semester, you have a history of difficulty with certain types of texts or certain types of work, it's incredibly valid to come in and just kind of chat with your professor. I had a student last year who came in just to kind of say, hey, I'm new to the American education system. So in addition to kind of being new to college, I have this, other concern. I'm not quite sure how these things work. And so that was something we could kind of work with over the semester, both for my class, but also for her other courses. So, that kind of communication I think was really helpful for her, and articulating that. And it also helped me to understand sometimes when things kind of went a little sideways, I had a context for that helped me to understand why it was going sideways. And then I could kind of reach out to that student and say, hey, so-and-so, I think what happened was this, and the way you want to do it is this other way. And I think that helped both of us quite a bit. So that's something that you can do. One thing about that I do want to kind of point out, though, is that sometimes students feel like in order to get an accommodation from their professors or to get compassion from their professors, that they kind of have to, that they owe us intimacy, or that they owe us all the details, or they owe us a doctor's note, or like, let's say I had a student who had to be a witness in a court case once, and he's like, I'll bring you the documents. And I'm like, you don't have to do that. You don't owe us your personal business. Okay, that's not a tax that you pay for the belief or the compassion of your professors. Okay, so at our school, you're not required to bring in any kind of documentation, at least not unless you're making some kind of appeal to the larger school. All the detail you have to give a professor is you just have to say, hey, I'm having a crisis, or, something's going on in my life and it's making me miss classes, or it's making it hard for me to focus right now. If you want to give like the barest information, like there's been a death in the family, or there's a family crisis, or there's a health problem going on right now, it can stop there. You don't have to tell us all the details. And often I've heard details I kind of wish I had, but you don't owe us that. If you feel comfortable telling us that, that's your right? But you don't owe us that as some kind of ticket, that you have to give that to us as some kind of form of, I don't know, groveling, so that we will then give you some compassion. Okay, so what I would say is if you have to communicate something that's going on, you only have to give us the barest outline, just so that we have enough of a picture that we can understand the scope of the problem, and how we can best respond. So is it a short-term problem? Is it a long-term problem? Do you not know? Those types of things. You don't have to give us any details you're uncomfortable sharing. Okay. And then of course for office hours, the last thing is, if you have an emergency, a crisis, or something that has majorly changed in your situation from the beginning of the semester, that you feel that we should know in order to best understand what's going on with you, or to accommodate what's going on in your situation, especially during, since COVID has started. I think a lot more professors who might not have been as flexible are understanding how to be more flexible, or thinking about ways to be more flexible. There are some things, there are some points past which we can't be. It's like, well, there's work you must turn in for us to, in good conscience, say you've passed the class. But a lot of faculty who might have been more rigid before COVID are a little bit more flexible on things like due dates, or anything like that. So that's just something to kind of keep in mind. So for short-term reasons to come to office hours, some of them are very ephemeral: to make better contact and communication with your professor, which can sometimes have a knockdown effect of the class making more sense, and you just kind of understanding just in general better what's going on. Two, you can supplement classroom discussion and kind of get some of the stuff one-on-one. And something that's good about that is in classroom, it's really hard to have a lot of back and forth with the professor, a lot of follow-up, just because we're often moving really quickly because there's so many things we need to get through, and also because there are so many people who could be potentially engaged in a conversation. In that one-on-one space, you have undivided attention. And so you get a lot more of that clarity that comes from you saying something, them replying to you, and you saying, well, did you mean this or this? And that kind of thing. That can be a lot harder or feel less comfortable to do in a classroom situation. And that's something that office hours are really great for. You can do a better job of planning your assignments ahead of time, so you have smoother sailing and a better understanding of what it is you're supposed to do before you do it. And you have the use of office hours for things like explaining when things aren't going well for you, whether in the class or in your personal life in ways that affect the class, either in the short term or in that kind of emergency stop everything. We need to talk about how things that aren't the class are actually threatening my ability to pass the class. Okay, those are the short-term uses of office hours. There's a more kind of what I would consider ephemeral, because at the time that you go in, you don't know if you're ever going to use it. Purpose to office hours. And that's basically that you're laying the groundwork for your recommendation letters. And I think this is one of those kind of life skills that people don't tell you about necessarily when you get to college. But the reality is that your professors very likely for the next several years of your life are going to be a prime source of your recommendation letters for other things going on in your life. So for example, in my experience, I have written recommendation letters for former students for their next school, right? For internships, for summer professionalization programs, and also for job applications. We're a kind of obvious go-to stop for that. And the thing about office hours is that when you go to office hours, you create a stronger one-on-one connection with a professor. It makes it a lot easier for us to write a detailed and personalized letter. So if you think about classroom interactions, often you might be in a class with 25 or more other students. And so there's only so much interaction, you're going to have. And if you tend to be a quiet person in particular, it may be even, more disproportionately less you, right? Office hours give your professor a chance to get to know you a lot more. And it also makes even the very beginning of our letter quite a lot easier to write, because we can start our letter by saying, hey, this student went above and beyond. They not only prepared well for class and did all these things for class, they consistently came to office hours in order to improve themselves. And, these are the things I learned about the student in office hours, right? It gives us that kind of script where we can paint you as a very particular type of student. And, we can talk about those specific things that happened in office hours as well as in the classroom. It gives a rounder picture of you. And that's one of the things that can make a recommendation letter much more effective, right? Is those details, that kind of picture of you as a person. And the less your professors know you, or your recommenders in general know you, the harder it is for them to paint that picture for whatever committee is later reading that letter. So it doesn't have to be my class, but I definitely recommend that every semester, minimum 2 professors, pick at least 2 professors, even if you aren't struggling in their classes, go to their office hours at least twice in a semester, because what you're kind of doing is you're auditioning your future letter writers. Okay, so I kind of want you to think of it that way. I mean, you're not actually going to run it like an audition, but what's going on is you're kind of planting the seeds for them to remember you as a specific person. And you're already giving them a little bit of a script to talk about you as a strong student who's doing more than just the minimum of going to class and doing their stuff. Okay. So, okay, great. Go to office hours. What do you do once you're there? So let's talk about this, because if you're going in there to kind of plead for clemency because things are going really poorly, we kind of know what that is. But what about these non-emergency uses of office hours? How do you prepare for it? Well, number one, kind of keep in mind of the modality of office hours. So for example, if office hours are online, it's likely your professor has a waiting room. So you may have to wait for others to leave. Just be aware of that and, have something else to do. If they don't immediately let you in, that doesn't mean, walk away. Just be aware that they're coming. For my students, I don't require them to have their cameras on, but my camera always is on, kind of knowing what the policies again of your professors. Some of your professors might want your camera to be on in office hours. So it's just a good idea to kind of know. Number one, if you're coming to office hours to discuss an assignment, one that's currently in progress or after the fact, like if you want to talk about a grade, and I do have a video about talking to professors about grades on this channel, you want to have your work already ready to point to share. And you want to have a specific focus or question about the work. So for example, if it's something you're working on right now, you don't want to hand your professor or share with your professor, if you're in an online venue, an entire draft and say, well, what do you think? That's overwhelming. And the reality is it's going to be overwhelming not only to them, but to you. They're not going to want to spend their time giving you an entire laundry list, and it's going to be very hard for you to prioritize what you actually need to pay attention to. So what I recommend is you actually focus on a very specific thing. So you might show them the introduction and say, I'm concerned about my thesis, right? Or something like that. Or if you're worried about something that covers the vast majority of your paper, pick one paragraph to focus on. So if, let's say it's early in the semester and we're talking about body paragraphs, you don't want to show a whole draft and say, well, what do you think? Take your first body paragraph or any body paragraph and say, do I have the body paragraph structured down? And then we can kind of go from there. You're not limited to one question, but you do want to give your professor something to focus on. If it's work that's already done and graded, if it's online, they probably, they'll have access to the work and to their comments online, but you should also have that window open so that you're both looking at the same thing at the same time. If it's in person, bring the graded copy with you, right? So that you both can look at it at the same time and you aren't trying to remember or asking your professor to remember their comments on your paper, which may be one of 150 they've graded in the last 2 weeks or more. Okay, so you just want to make sure that you make it easy for both you and your professor to look at the same things, and that you have a clear focus. That focus may wander after that first question. That's fine, right? But I just really want to strongly suggest, do not throw a whole assignment, whether it's a writing assignment or whatever your other courses, and then basically say, okay, tell me everything, tell me the secrets of the universe. That's not very active learning. Okay, your professor is going to want to focus on a specific thing that allows you to then translate that information into improving the rest of your work. So like I might help you with a body paragraph and then suggest that you use that to revise the next body paragraph. So we both know by the end of the session that you're comfortable with whatever adjustment we both just made, right? That way you leave actually having learned something, as opposed to have gotten a laundry list of like a to-do list. Okay. Now, that's the most effective thing that I would say in terms of coming in with an assignment. If you're just coming in having a question or a comment from class, then you just refer back to that moment in class, say the thing that you found interesting or that you would have liked to have discussed further, and then generally your professors are excited to talk about these things and you two are going to be off to the races. Okay. Now, if you are coming because of a lapse in coursework or some kind of a crisis or emergency that has really disrupted your ability to work in the class, the best advice I can give you is lay out the information that you're comfortable sharing, explain how that's affected it. If you have a game plan, if you think you can cover things, suggest that or ask what their suggestions are for a game plan. Okay. As you guys kind of come to whatever kind of agreement you do, take notes. Again, when you are in crisis mode, often you will be like, oh yes, I'm definitely going to remember this when I leave. And it often goes a little sideways. So take notes, and then critically, as soon as you're out of there and as soon as you can get to a device, email the professor back to confirm whatever agreement you came to on, future or adjusted due dates or assignments, all of that information. You want to do that because, again, your professor may have 100, 150 students. They may forget things, they may misremember things, right? They may have a whole line of students coming in and out, and they may in good faith remember it differently. So you want in writing their confirmation of whatever deal you made. And if you misunderstood, or you both came out of it thinking two different things, you want to know what they believe, right? Or what their understanding is, because unfortunately, we're the ones grading you, right? You need to know what it is you need to do as soon as possible. You don't want to turn it in, and feel that you're following whatever agreement you had and then have them say, no, actually we agreed X. So I want to give you a quick script for the kind of email you might send a professor in a situation like this. Okay, so let me share. Okay, so here we go. This is a very formulaic letter, but it hits all of the points that you would need to hit in a situation like this. So this letter goes basically, hey, okay, you're not going to say, hey, dear Professor X, fill in the name of the professor. It's really important that you give your full name, that you say what class you're in, and that is both, whatever class it follows, right? So if you're in English 101, you want to say English 101, but you also want to give the days and times, because most of your professors often teach multiple sections of the same course. So you want to give as much information, because this isn't just to jog their memory right now. This is a document for the future. So if they sort of back out or something goes wrong in the future, you want a paper trail. Okay, so you're going to say, hi, this is my full name from your whatever day and time your class is. And then you want to verify that you guys had a meeting on X date at X time, or, afternoon or whatever, the morning of, the afternoon of whatever day, to discuss the progress in class, how it has been recently impacted by, my health crisis, a death in the family, whatever, and in that place, you only mention only to the level of degree that you mentioned in your conversation, or you can be even vaguer than you were in the conversation. Okay. This phrase is actually really helpful in life. My understanding was right? This is one of those great phrases that basically says, as far as I understand, it's this. And if that's not true, it's on you now to correct me. But it's very helpful in not getting people's back up when you're like, this is what happened. And they're like, no, it isn't. It is my understanding, is one of those phrases that you find yourself using a lot in school and work, especially when dealing with someone who has some power over you that you don't want to offend, but you're worried about the circumstance where they might remember things differently. Okay, my understanding from the meeting is, and then you fill in what your understanding of the agreement was. So, if they say, this work is dead and gone and you can't come back to it, but this work is still on the table and it must be done by this date, then you lay that out. If the agreement was, you can turn it all in, but at a 15% late penalty, fill that in, whatever the agreement was, that's what this section is for. Okay. After that, have an explicit request to be corrected if anything here is not as they have agreed. That is your cover your butt moment, right? So if later they're like, well, I didn't read it carefully, whatever, you have a very good case for saying, look, I did everything in my power. I laid it out. You never corrected me. I acted in good faith. Okay, please let me know if I've misunderstood anything from our conversation. And then you close with a kind of polite acknowledgement of the assistance. So in this case, I appreciate your time and assistance, and I will continue to work hard in your class, or however else you want to put it. What you're kind of doing here is sort of performing good faith, right? And then you sign off. Okay, I hope that's an okay script for you. Sometimes I find, having talked to students or talked to people who are students in other people's classes, or people in my life who are students but not at my school, a lot of times I find students really feel paralyzed in terms of what to say to a professor, or what is the right way to say a thing. This is a pretty formulaic script that is not super formal, but very clear, both in terms of what its aims are and what your needs are. And that's really what you need in a communication like that. It's very much a communication that is aimed at protecting you, both in the short term, in terms of making sure you do have the information correct in the ways that make you most likely to have a successful semester, but it's also about protecting you in the future from a bad memory or anything nefarious from a professor who didn't keep good records, or anything else that could possibly happen. And you're creating a paper trail, and not to live in a complete paranoid dystopia, but having a paper trail is always good, especially when, school is a bureaucracy. So sometimes if you have to appeal something, having that paper trail is a point in your favor. Okay. This probably went a little long. I'm really sorry, but I hope it was helpful. The too long didn't read. Go to office hours. Your professor's time is already set aside. I can tell you personally, if I'm not talking to students, I'm either dealing with paperwork or grading, or dealing with work email. I'd much rather be talking to my students, right? Your professors got into this because we're interested in the things we teach, and hopefully we're interested in our students. And ultimately, even if some of your professors aren't, that time belongs to you. And it's a free benefit that belongs to you. So please do use it to your benefit, and also think of it as an investment in your relationship with your professor, and an investment in your class success, but also as an investment in potential recommendation letters for the future. Okay. All right. Have a great semester, and I wish you all success.